you're never going to be a great programmer, I think, unless you can communicate your intent to the rest of the team.
And I think not enough emphasis is placed on just writing as a skill in the programming world.
Individual productivity rose through the roof. We're going to have the same thing happen to us. And that is going to mean fewer jobs. You know, that's just how that works.
How do I pronounce your last name, by the way?
Great question. So it's Pocock. And Technically, there's no American equivalent for the O sound, so it's Pocock, I guess you would have to say. Pocock.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's it.
Pocock.
But
I have to be a little careful how you say it, or it kind of...
Well, no, I mean, it's right there in the name, you know what I mean? Like, it's no getting around it. It's just in there. It's built in.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure I didn't pronounce it that way if it was pronounced a different way.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess you could not emphasize it, I suppose. It's a question of emphasis. It's Pocock, not Pocock.
I was going to say it would be more convenient if English had the accent, the accents like Spanish, so that it would be more clear that it's Pocock.
Yes, okay.
Speaking of which,
yeah,
you do like voice and linguistic stuff, or you did, right?
Yeah, so I was a singing teacher and voice teacher, accent coach for 6 years before I became a dev. This was basically my career coming out of university. I did like a university degree in drama. And yeah, I was a singing teacher in London and Guildford in the south of England for 6 years. And I loved it, but I hated living in London. And so I wanted to get out. And that's how I became a dev, was basically retraining myself to become a dev, because you can do that from anywhere. And so I wanted to come back, live in the countryside, which is where I am now. And yeah, that's how that happened.
We have a lot in common. Before I jump into that, I just want to preface this by telling everyone, yes, we are going to talk about TypeScript. Yeah. We're going to talk about TypeScript till you're bored of TypeScript. But for a second, I just got to talk about a couple things we have in common. So you wanted to move out of London to go live in the country. I am finally realizing that dream. I mean, Salt Lake City is not as big as London, but I am in 3 weeks moving back to my hometown, just kind of a rural area in southern Utah. Finally able to work fully remote and make that happen. I've been in Salt Lake for 7 or 8 years. So
I've been to Salt Lake, actually. I've only been to 2 places in the US. I went to New York when I was 14, and I went to Salt Lake City in 2022. And I was like, America has changed a lot, since I was last year. Yeah, Salt Lake's nice. I love
comparing it to New York City.
Well, I mean, I'd only been to America twice, once it was New York and the second time it was Salt Lake. And I thought...
I was going to say, it hasn't changed. Those 2 cities just couldn't be more different.
Yeah, I went to a really nice burger place while I was there. You got the beautiful mountains. Well, that's wonderful. You're getting out of the big city, moving out into countryside. I couldn't be more proud. It's a wonderful thing to do.
Okay, I promised we'll talk about TypeScript. So let's talk a little bit about TypeScript. Actually, I do have one more kind of weird transition, which is, you mentioned that you kind of were a voice coach, obviously have a background in English and language. I think it's very well accepted that programmers typically come from a math background, right? Because computer science is very maths heavy. I don't know if you noticed there, I used maths. I believe that's the correct term in England. Very maths heavy. And I think very often we overlook how kind of communication and language heavy programming really is. And I would argue, especially at the application level, where maybe you're not solving as hard of math problems day to day, and it's more about communicating in a team and communicating with the machine. What are your thoughts on that? If you had to prescribe a percentage of what makes a good programmer, what percent math, what percent communication skills?
I mean, whenever you're programming, you're trying to communicate intent, right? Either you're communicating intent to a computer, right? Trying to tell them what you're doing. And in that case, you need to speak the language of the computer, right? You need to speak in math. You need to figure out exactly what is the right way to allocate memory and figure out all this low-level stuff. And people who are really good at that are, I would say, good programmers. But the really great programmers, I think, are the ones who can do all of that. And do all of that, you can get really, 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 really good at that. But you're never going to be a great programmer, I think, unless you can communicate your intent to the rest of the team. Because obviously, the work that you do communicating to the computer, it's kind of... it's almost like you're communing with the spirit world, right? Like you're just, no one can access that bond you have between you and how you understand your code. And the only way that people can get access through that or to that is through your words, right? Through the way that you talk. And the really good communicators or the really good programmers are great communicators, and especially in writing. So that means I've tried to be more disciplined with myself in this recently, is basically every time you write a PR, you basically got to write an essay. You know what I mean? You've got to explain everything about like what motivated the changes. You've got to make it concise. And really, really good programmers, especially I think those working on library code, working in contexts where you have to communicate your intention more broadly to a wider audience, they tend to be better communicators. Because I think we've seen a lot of times in the open source community, if you're not that great a communicator, your ideas tend to get misinterpreted, and your library can not be so popular as a result, or people can start drifting away from your library as a result. So I think actually this idea of communication, it doesn't necessarily have to be face-to-face communication, but just written communication, the ability to empathize with what people are saying, or thinking about your product and your code, is so, so important. And the more you can communicate, the more that feeds into the rest of your company, the easier your code is to consume by others, and the less the bus factor becomes a factor, right? Because people can just jump into your code. The bus factor being, if you get hit by a bus, who's going to be able to take your place, right? And if you're able to communicate really well, that's the thing I think that separates the good engineer from the great engineer.
Do you think it's fair to say that for like a domain of problems that you're working on, the math skills that you need are maybe more binary, in the sense that you kind of have them or you don't have them? If you don't have them, you probably need to go get them. Whereas like the communication skills that take you from this like much more gray area of like good to great is kind of a softer thing that develops over time. Yeah,
this concept of like soft skills, you know, I think, how do you become a good writer? How do you become a good communicator? It's like, it's hard because you need to, I think, be keyed into other people and be able to tune in to other people, predict what they're going to be thinking about what you're writing and what you're trying to communicate. That's often a thing I have to think about a lot when I'm making training materials as well. Is like, at what state of mind are my students in? And that's something that I think you have to learn by basically brute forcing. It's kind of the same as in programming. I mean, I guess in programming, in math, you can look up the answer. There is usually an answer to a certain question that you're trying to ask. And so if anything, that knowledge is, I think, more attainable. You can, like, if you have like a math background, you probably have a few more mental models for helping you deal with complexity and complex algorithms and that kind of thing that someone who comes from a drama background like I do has, you know. But I found that knowledge was a lot easier to come by and figure out and work together piecemeal than actually communicating with people. Communicating, I think, is the harder get, and I think also undervalued.
I agree. I think we don't talk about it enough, and I think not enough emphasis is placed on just writing as a skill in the programming world. Granted, I will point out a distinction. I think that you mentioned, like, you know, being able to write a really great essay about your PR is a valuable skill. And I tend to agree, especially in open source and on large teams and within big corporations. I'm a big fan of the indie hacker project, push straight to main, commit message, more changes. Huge fan of that. You know, nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely. I've worked in that context like quite a lot, actually. For most of my career before I quit and became an educator, I was in the startup phase. But I guess because I've been in that phase for quite a long time, I know working at companies in that growth phase, I really want to be part of a team that's running on a 20-year code base. I've got this sort of grass is greener on the other side thing where I just want to be maintaining something. And I think a lot of people feel like this when they're working in programming, is they just want to feel like a professional. You know, they want to do what the professionals do. And that's still where my head is at. And that's That's what I've been trying to work on for myself and for my own programming, actually, is just like trying to write better, trying to reason better. And yeah.
As promised, it's time to talk about OCaml. So you've been doing OCaml for 20 years. Tell us a little bit about OCaml.
I know bloody nothing about OCaml, I have to say. Nothing. I'm a proper like TypeScript one trick. I really am. I really am.
There's a running joke that this podcast way over represents OCaml because we've had like, I don't know how many guests, more than 5, more than I can count on one hand, come on to talk about OCaml. So I just had to throw that in there for him. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about TypeScript then. You know, that thing that no one uses in production.
Yeah, that tiny little niche language that they came up with at this teeny company and just failed on arrival.
Now that we've done 5 OCaml episodes, I feel like it's probably about time to at least give TypeScript the time of day.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I got some questions lined up for you about TypeScript. Let's start with the high level. So my first question is in a non-sarcastic way, have we reached peak TypeScript, or is the world going to get eaten by TypeScript? I still don't know the answer to this question. I want to get your take.
So I guess your question is, what is TypeScript's future? What will we be doing in 10 years? TypeScript's been around for 11 years. Will we still be writing TypeScript in the same way in 2034, let's say? And I guess what we're assuming there is we're assuming that JavaScript is still going to be around, because TypeScript now more than ever is like cleaving so close to JavaScript, like they almost can't be pulled apart. TypeScript never adds any more runtime features that JavaScript doesn't have. It used to.
But couldn't Bun like... I remember all I read was a headline, but can't Bun just like run TypeScript like without having to do a precompile step? Maybe that's a thing. I don't know.
So I think Bun, what it does is it basically strips out the types before it runs the JavaScript. That's what it's doing. Does, I think, a little bit of source mapping, but it uses something like SWC, which is a bundler, essentially, or a transpiler, to just remove the types and then just do that. So it's not doing anything clever with the types. It is still just running JavaScript and doing some extra module resolution to make sure that it points at TS files instead of JS files for imports. I think that's what Bun does. That's what Dino does. Node is debating adding TypeScript support as well under a flag. And that, I think, is what they will do as well. Now, your question, though, was about like the future of TypeScript and the future of that kind of thing. Like, there are possible futures where, I don't know, we get some sort of runtime that will be able to take the types that TypeScript has and use them to influence the runtime, you know? To basically speed up JavaScript, let's say, to be able to feed that information into a V8 equivalent and basically say, okay, we know this is a string, and so allocate it specifically as a string or blah, 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 blah.
It's like you think the JIT, like just-in-time compiler might be able to get faster with type information.
That is a possible future, but I don't think it's possible, basically. I don't think that's something that's going to happen.
It's possible, but you think it's very unlikely.
I don't think it's going to happen, really. Okay. I mean, it could happen. It could happen, but I don't think that's the future. So I think the future of TypeScript is that it will eventually be merged into JavaScript in some form. And so instead of, I think in 10 years' time, instead of writing TS files, we're going to be only writing JS files, but we're going to be adding TypeScripty types to them. TypeScript will still exist, I think, and it will basically just be a type checker for JavaScript files. So I think that's
the future of TypeScript is a advanced linter.
Yeah, basically, yes. It's going to be the type checker for JavaScript files.
That's effectively the route that Python's taking, right? By adding type hint, like slowly adding more and more type hinting to the language.
I don't know anything about any other language. I really am totally ignorant about developments in other languages. I know that, you know, I think Python has some sort of type hint stuff. I know that Ruby has a little bit of that as well. But honestly, I'm such a monomaniac when it comes to languages. I really am just a JavaScript dude.
Fair enough. Yeah, my understanding of Python type hinting, which to be fair, most of the Python I did was before type hinting was popular, or I should say even existed and now is becoming more popular, is that it basically just ignores, like the interpreter basically just ignores the types completely, but editors pick up on the types and can give you like the nice IntelliSense kind of features.
And
stuff like that.
There's a proposal coming into JavaScript potentially that has been in the works for a while that would do exactly the same thing. That basically it would just ignore certain spots in like the AST. So let's say after a variable name, for instance, it would just let you add something in there and it would treat it as a comment. So it's types as comments is the proposal.
Okay, I'm familiar with something like this. Is this the JSDoc stuff or is that completely separate?
JSDocs is like you basically add comments, like literal JavaScript comments into your JavaScript code. TypeScript is actually smart enough to understand them. But the difference is that the syntax for JSDoc is what it's called. Adding type annotations there is really verbose. Like you've got to add an entire comment. You've got to say, this parameter is this, blah, 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 blah. It's like 100 characters where TypeScript does it in 7 or something, And so actually I would call that like a second class solution, whereas this would be like a first class solution, actual annotations on the variables like you're used to doing in TypeScript, first class syntax. And JavaScript would ignore it, but TypeScript would be able to pick it up and give you hints.
About 4 years ago, some really smart people that I knew and looked up to were very much in favor of the JSDoc thing over the TypeScript thing. And it just never sat well with me because one of my, and I don't understand all of the underlying details as to why these decisions were made. So I don't want to come across as like, I know better and this shouldn't have happened. But like one thing that's always bothered me about Go is that we have comments that effectively are executable. Like there's kind of these, meta tags that you can do in comments to like, generate code or embed binaries within your code. And it's always bothered me. Like, it's like these special comments that actually do things versus just, comments that don't do anything. It's like the first thing we teach programmers is comments don't do anything. And so that always bothered me about JSDoc. It's like they're comments that, need to be syntactically correct in order to be effective. And, so that's why I've always been, if I'm doing types, I'd rather kind of have it built into the language syntax.
Again, second class versus first class, and there are some very subtle things that you can't do in JSDoc that you can do in TypeScript, like non-null assertions, for instance, adding like an exclamation point to the end of a variable or like reference or something in TypeScript means that it's like you cut null or undefined out of it. There's no equivalent in JSDoc. You can pass type arguments directly to functions in TypeScript. There's not really an equivalent in JSDoc. Some people love it. Like Svelte kicked up a huge fuss a few years ago when they, I think not actually deliberately, people kicked up the fuss for them, as often happens, when they moved over to JSDoc instead of TypeScript. Big repo, getting rid of TypeScript, quote unquote, and moving to JSDoc. In fact, what they did was, they moved the syntax over to JSDoc, but they're still using TypeScript to do their type checking and things like that. So, like, the future of TypeScript,
they're using the TypeScript tooling, right? The TypeScript compiler.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, they're using the TypeScript compiler. They're using the TypeScript server in VS Code to get exactly the same behavior as they had with TypeScript, just different syntax. So I think that's the experience we're going to have in the future. It's just, so JSDoc is the future, oddly, or the behavior of JSDoc, but with TypeScript syntax.
Yeah. Instead of stripping comments, we're going to strip code.
We're going to ignore bits of code that are treated as comments, basically.
Yeah.
I think I would love to see that brought in.
Yeah, I think that would be my preferred way. I mean, as long as it remains an interpreted or just-in-time compiled language, like something that we're not building like a machine code executable binary from. So there's no like absolute need for a compile step. It makes a lot of sense to me to just try to inline all the tooling. And then you don't have a build step. And then we don't have to argue about that anymore.
But it's odd because it's really only going to benefit, I think, front-end applications. Like front-end applications will always need to bundle, no matter what happens. They will always need to bundle unless there is something like something changes about the web platform that makes it less hostile to like module scripts, basically.
I mean, I think with big like web apps for sure. But it would be pretty cool to just be able to like add TypeScript snippets to like more static type sites and content sites. And those sites don't necessarily need to bundle.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you just get such a better developer experience when you bundle like you get to minify, you get to use React, let's say, or Vue or Svelte or whatever. You get your front-end frameworks working. Your development experience is fast, which it sometimes isn't if you're doing the kind of DHH no bundling thing, which is an option too. Bundling's just great. I mean, I don't see it moving away from front-end anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, for web apps like the boot dev web app, it's like, there's no way we're escaping bundling anytime soon. I don't see how that's even a possibility. But like on our blog, it's a static site, and we have like maybe 5 custom scripts that are just like, JavaScript tags. And I mean, it's not the end of the world, but like if I could have added like a TS annotation there and gotten type hinting in my editor, like I definitely would have.
Yeah, and that feels like a kind of silent majority thing.
Tens of seconds in
exactly,
debugging in the editor. So
exactly, you wouldn't have to run that dev script. How good would that be? Absolutely.
Okay. You mentioned undefined and null. This was a question I also had on my list. Do you ever use null in TypeScript, or do you try to stick to undefined?
Oh, great question. I mean, similar to other people, I wish null didn't exist. I don't really see the point of it. Often people have this kind of like semantic difference, like they see a null and it communicates something differently from when they see an undefined. I don't care. I don't know. I don't. It's just I don't get that at all. Like,
yeah,
it has some difference, I guess, inside when you're receiving fields through JSON or something, I suppose, like a field exists or doesn't exist.
Like key is gone versus maps to null.
I hate that. I just hate that distinction. What's the point? It's either there or not there, guys. Like, what are we doing? And expecting null to have a different... Everyone has a slightly different interpretation about that rule as well. I wish null didn't exist. Obviously, type of null being an object as well is just rubbing salt in the open wound. And... yeah, and it's nice TypeScript now, it didn't always used to, treats null and undefined differently. So null is not assignable to undefined, and the opposite is true too. So you get to have a bit of safety there. But in general, I just treat them as essentially indistinguishable. I don't tend to use one over the other. And in fact, I just tend not to use null at all, really.
It's so annoying when you have a type signature that returns string, null, or undefined, and now you have to deal with all three. And I actually recently found this out. I'm sure you knew this, but Microsoft has like official TypeScript like recommendations, and one of them is don't use null. Like just use undefined all the time.
I didn't know that actually. I'd love to find out where that is. I'd love to know where that is.
It's funny because I've done a decent amount of TypeScript over the last few years, but my whole career has been as a backend developer writing Go. And so like all the JavaScript and TypeScript I've done has just been for myself on side projects, boot dev included. And I never took an incredible course like Total TypeScript. So I'm doing whatever the hell I want, right?
Yeah.
And recently we had Sarah, Bad Cop, for any Twitch listeners, join the team. And she was like, what the hell? Like, are all these nulls in the code base? Like, why are you doing null? And I'm like, well, in my mind... null and undefined are basically the same thing.
Yeah.
And guess what? Null has 4 letters in it, and undefined has, fuck if I know how many letters in it, a lot more.
It's got the same number of letters when AI is writing your code, like that used to be more relevant than it is now. Damn.
And we did, like, boot dev didn't start on TypeScript either. It started as just plain JavaScript. So I was just using null all the time. And she was like, no, like undefined's better. And I was like, why? And she basically gave me kind of the explanation that you're giving. It's like it's more undefined.
Yeah.
And I went and found that Microsoft doc that was like, just don't use null. And I was like, all right, I'm on board. And we just refactored out all the nulls.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I have a similar attitude to it to like enums, which is I'm not going to kick it out of my code base. If it's in there, it's in there. You know what I mean? If I accidentally sort of say, this returns string or null, it's fine. But on my best days, I'm not adding null to my code base as much as possible. And you're right, the kind of thing or null or undefined is just horrible because you do end up just having to just deal with both of them.
But I do stand behind the one thing that null has going for it is that it's 4 characters instead of 17. I don't know. Who can count that high? However many undefined has.
Trying to work out, can you alias like undefined to you or something globally across your whole code base? You probably could, couldn't you?
That'd be nice, yeah. It's a very long word for a keyword,
Undefined. No, I like my keywords to be long, actually. I wish all keywords were like 10 letters or something. Just make them really stand out.
That's the thing that weirdly like love so much about Rust, even though I don't really write Rust, is in JavaScript you have function, or in TypeScript you have function as the keyword, and then in Go you have func, and in Rust they're just like fuck it, fn. I'm waiting for the language that just uses f, and then
exactly
I'm in.
Great, you're in. That's your dream language. Just literally write minified code. That's the dream.
I mean, yeah, like for slow typers like me, we do appreciate it. Okay, moving on to more TypeScript goody questions. Let's talk a little bit about interfaces versus type aliases, or the type keyword, because this is another one that, like, especially early on when I started doing TypeScript, I just did whatever the hell I want. Most of the time I'm just trying to specify that like this object literal has these certain fields. But I know there are differences. And so do you have, like, number one, a rule of thumb, and then two, maybe you can go into a little bit of the nuance between, you know, the differences between them.
Yeah, like, this is an awkward question, isn't it? Because you're basically asking, when I define an object type of some type that I want to reuse throughout my code base in a front-end framework, that might be like, you know, props or something, or, you know, the properties that your whatever API receives or something. What do you use? What do you default to? Do you always use type for your objects, or do you always use interface? Now, the differences are objects, or types rather, can be unions. You know, you can have this object or this object. Types can be literally any type in TypeScript. Functions, they can be, you know, whatever, strings and numbers, all that sort of thing. And so in general, having types is like, yeah, sure, I can express anything with this. It's cool. It's a Swiss Army knife. Do you have Swiss Army knives in the US?
I've never owned one, but
okay.
The term is used.
You know what they are. Okay,
we're familiar. Yeah,
that's good. Sorry,
we prefer guns, but
you stop dropping in those Europeanisms. Yeah, I don't know what the Swiss Army knife of gun would be. Anyway,
I don't know
either. So yeah, you've got this, like, types can be used for anything. Interfaces can only be used for objects and very occasionally functions. Now, this means that interfaces, I think, are better at expressing objects than types are. This is, I think, quite a new thought that I've had. And the reason for that is that, let's say you want to combine two objects together and they're both types. Let's say you have, I don't know, a user object and then like a admin roles object, and you want to smush them together. And so you've got the ID and name coming from the user object, and you've got the roles coming from the roles object, right? If we imagine something like that. Smush them together and you get like an admin user or something. Now you can do that with types. With types, you would use an intersection where you take the ampersand key and you basically just say this, and they smush together and create a nice object. And you can do that too with interfaces, but you would have to use interface extends. So you would say, okay, my admin user extends user, but it adds some extra properties. Okay. Now, in TypeScript, it's actually much more efficient and safer to use interface extends than it is for combining those types. Because interface extends, it's actually going to give you some guarantees when you're smushing those two objects together. And there's like an order, if you think about it. So you've got the base object, and then you've got the thing that you're smushing into it. You know, like there's some inheritance going on there. And the thing that's being smushed in, it has to correlate with the base. So you can't, for instance, if you have ID string in the base, you then can't smush in ID number using interface extends. Does that make sense?
But you can do that
You can do that in types. And in types, what you'll get is it will go, okay, you're combining ID string and ID number. Okay, smush those together. It lets you do it, no error whatsoever. But then what type is ID? It's not going to be string
or number.
It's not string or number, right? Because if it was a union, that would
was
work.
Scary.
It's not going to be string or number. It's actually going to be string and number, which is impossible. And so it resolves to a type of never. That ID is never going to be defined.
So just silently becomes never.
Silently becomes never. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is rough.
Like, at least TypeScript's a little more sane than JavaScript, because like I would expect it to basically break. The unfortunate thing is that it breaks in an unusable way versus like an erroneous way.
Yeah, it breaks in a way. I mean, nothing is assignable to never, so you will eventually, like somewhere down the chain, when you use this type, you will get a weird error, right? And you'll go, what the hell is that doing there? And you'll go back through the chain. But often that chain is quite complex, especially if you've got some deep intersections. Whereas with an interface, you'll get that error right at the top. Nice. Okay, immediately when you assign it, it's not going to let you do it. But interfaces also have some weirdnesses as well. If you have an interface, two interfaces in the same file with the same name, let's say, and this can sometimes happen. It's happened to me before when I've got like a 2,000 line file. I've got like shape defined at the top and then shape defined at the bottom. If you've got those defined as two types, then you'll get an error saying duplicate identifier because you can't have two types with the same name. But in two interfaces with the same name, silently merge.
No, I didn't know that either.
Yeah, they declaration
That's scary
merge.
as shit. All right.
It's scary as, it's not great. This only happens when they're in the same scope, so when they're in the same module scope. So like if you have two interfaces across your code base, unless they're in the global scope, which they can accidentally be sometimes, they won't merge. But yeah, two interfaces will declaration merge together and you'll end up with not a fun time. So both of them have weird pros and cons, right? Like I think as long as you're being sensible with your interfaces are the better way to go. And when you're doing this kind of like merging thing, interface extends always beats intersections, not only because it's safer, it's actually TypeScript's compiler can interpret that faster because it has more guarantees to it. The other one, it has to, I
check
find
some
it really
edge cases or something. Yeah.
I find it really hard to explain the difference in speed, but basically in TypeScript's docs, it recommends you use this interface extends over intersections. But then you also have this weird behavior of the declaration merging of two interfaces with the same name. So I tend to, these days, I used to recommend types until you need a feature of interfaces. But now I actually do the reverse. Use interfaces until you need a feature of types. That's where my head's at. There are other weird differences as well, but slightly too technical, I think, to explain now. And I do have a lengthy blog post about this as well, which you can find on Total TypeScript.
Good. I've defaulted to the correct-ish thing then.
Oh, good.
We've mostly been using interfaces and occasionally thrown a type in there, and I have not yet, luckily, run into this weird merging behavior, but it's good to know that is a danger. It's
pretty gnarly. And I think as well, the real difference is not between type and interface. I think they're basically interchangeable. You can use whatever you want. But intersections, so smushing two types with types, and interface extends, that's the real difference. And you should always use interface extends.
I want to talk about, this is more of like a gray area topic. I don't know if you've ever heard the Primogen use the term type masturbation, but it's basically this idea that we can
picture it vividly.
Yeah. You're playing with your types. You know, there's a lot of types that you could make, and you spend a lot of time making them. I wonder if you have any like rules of thumb for how intense you get with your types. And let me give like a very basic example. So oftentimes you could type something as any. This would be like the laziest thing you could do, right? Like, just any, and we'll just like pass some stuff in, whatever. You could like scope that down to a string. Great. Now you have a lot more safety. Or, you could type that down to like one of 4 specific string values, right? There's only these 4 string values that are valid. You could treat it kind of, it could be an enum. It could also be like a type union. Like you can get more and more specific, and then you can also do crazy things with like, you could define 2 separate interfaces and just like, you've got some redundancy there, or like you mentioned, you can do some like crazier stuff with extends and start merging all the types together and having them kind of inherit properties from each other. I admit I'm a little grug-brained. A lot of times I'll just like, interface 1, interface 2, interface 3. There's like 3 overlapping fields, but like I'm too lazy to do all the stuff. How do you think about this? Like, how much time do you spend getting just the right types?
It's a great question. And I've got an entire chapter about this in my book as well, actually, which is a free book online, Total TypeScript Essentials. I like to think of it as like I'm going to take that interface example there where you've got like 3 overlapping interfaces that could, let's imagine that you wanted to, like, if you were like doing type masturbation, let's say, you would maybe take all of those and like find a single source of truth, or maybe like a source of truth that then inherits another source of truth, another source of truth, so that you can find one, like change one type in the base, and then it sort of inherits through to all of them. I would call that basically types derived from other types. So like deriving types, I would say. So you have one type in the source, and then other types are derived from that. And you can get really crazy with this, which is you can basically have like your source of truth doesn't have to be a type as well. It can be a value that you then extract maybe the keys of that from, use that to type something else, use that blah, 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 and just get these crazy chains of types, especially through your application code. This is very possible. But then if you think about the opposite to that, what's the opposite? You've got deriving on one side, where you create this sort of coupling between all of your types, or you can decouple your types. You can just have different interfaces for different concerns, and just basically go smash, 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 smash. And the discussion here, I think, is really, really important. And it's important when you're thinking about it, because decoupling, it has upsides and downsides. If you have, let's say, I'm going to use a front-end example, where let's say you have a nav bar, right? And that nav bar displays a little user avatar thing. And so you need to, some properties of that user need to be put into the nav bar. And let's say you just go, oh, I need a user, right? So why don't I just grab the user type that I've got from, let's say, my database, that I know what it is. I've got it already defined. I'll just use that. And so you just plop the whole user in there. And so you might get some sort of random access properties and stuff, but you're using quite a lot of the user anyway, so it feels normal. Well, now that type and that component as well, that navbar, is coupled to your user in your database. You know what I mean? Just by a type being put in slightly the wrong spot. And so there, I think it makes much more sense to decouple it, right? To have the navbar own its own properties, own the thing that needs to get passed into it, and then have that user be totally different, to have them not linked in any way. And so I think that's the decision. It's very, very possible, though, to take this too far and end up making your app really hard to maintain, because you need to change one thing in one place and then ripple out and do tons and tons of changes. It can feel extremely powerful to have your types linked, to basically have a single source of truth or multiple sources of truth that sort of all flow into each other. And that can feel great and can feel like a massive improvement to velocity. So that, I think, is the decision, is deriving types versus decoupling your types. And that is somewhat like that. I think that is key to being a productive TypeScript developer.
So there's almost two separate discussions here in my mind. One is like, how do you build nice encapsulated components that don't have like weird external dependencies, right? Like it's weird for a nav bar to depend on a database model when it probably just needs to accept a, profile picture and profile name or something like that.
Yeah.
I almost sometimes like to think of it as like, if I were to publish this on NPM, would I have it accept like my database model as props with like all these fields it doesn't need? Like, no, I'd probably like, give it some specific things that it needs, name them in maybe a more generic way, that sort of thing.
The key word being portability there as well, right? Like how portable is this component? How portable is this function?
Yeah, if we grab the data now from an API instead of directly from our database, are we going to have to do some weird changes, right? So fully with you there. A kind of related question I have is this idea of, okay, we can have the kind of derived types, this nice flowy type diagram that we talked about, or we can have kind of the grug brain, like I'm just going to define this interface 5 times. And on the one hand, the way I'm thinking about it, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, basically, is that by doing the derived type things, in a lot of ways, it's better for the type author. Because like I only have to change things in one place, right? Like all the types nicely flow. I won't have any like weird duplicate issues. If I need to change one field, I won't have to change it in 4 places. I can just change it in the one place and it'll derive everything else. But, and maybe this is a skill issue on my part, sometimes I've used heavily derived types. And as a user of the type, it is such a pain in the ass to figure out like what I need. Because I'm like, okay, go to definition of type. And it's just like, oh, it's this type and that type. I go to that type. Oh, it's this one and that one. Oh, it's this one or that one or that one. And I'm spending like way longer trying to figure out what's actually in the damn thing. And it's like the whole purpose of types was to make everything easy on us. And again, maybe that's a skill issue. Maybe there's just some tooling that I'm unaware of that would make this whole thing easier for me. But I feel like in some ways, kind of just having, almost more simple, more concrete types, even if there is some redundancy, could be easier on the user of that type.
It's tricky because there's a balance, right? Like when you're debugging that stuff, it can be a massive pain, as you've described. And if the types are not, set up correctly as well, like it sounds like you're using a lot of sort of smushing there, like with type this and that. I guess with interface
I'm also thinking of like library code that I'm importing, right? And it's like it's got some hairy type deriving going on.
Yeah, I mean, I was chatting to, I think, Orta the Rocks about this, who used to work on the TypeScript team and was key in implementing it in Svelte. And I basically asked him, like, why are especially generic functions and like generic types and that sort of the sort of really complex TypeScript stuff, what would TypeScript look like if it didn't have that? You would basically need to do, like, everything would be decoupled, right? It would basically just be like Grog style, just sort of smashing out your types and sort of having to manually type them like that. I think, though, that there is an expectation from users nowadays, whether that, and users being, let's say you have an open source library, you're writing your code, or it could be other people on your team, maybe less experienced people on your team who are also like consuming the types that you've written, consuming the code that you've written. I think there's an expectation from users now that some stuff should just work, right? If I am using useQuery and React Query or something, or I'm using a Zod schema or something, it should understand what my inputs were and properly transform my outputs on the type level. And I think when you get that right, when you're able to build an API that does that properly, it feels amazing. But then the debugging experience, you're right. I think there's still work that the TypeScript team can do to figure that out. But I don't think the solution is just to decouple everything, is to go back to, is to essentially remove the smart type stuff from the language. Like, there's got to be some sort of middle ground. And again, this idea of decoupling,
I fully agree. Like, removing it from the language would be crazy. I'm just curious, like, if you always go as far as you can when writing your own types, or if you do sometimes kind of, this is good enough for now. A
great example of that is, like, I get asked this actually quite a lot, is can you create a type for a hex code, right? A type for a hex code, like a valid hex code string.
Yeah, like a regex almost.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And I think it is technically possible. Like you could say, just create a massive union type between all the possible regex, like all the possible hex codes.
It's possible if it's a finite set, I guess.
I mean, TypeScript does have some built-in like boundaries, like your union type can only be like 100,000 members long or something. Otherwise, it just breaks. But I get asked that question a lot, and I just say, just use a string type. It doesn't matter. Just use a string type, or create an integer type for me, just use a number, So there's absolutely like limits on what you should do, and I think that concept of decoupling is really important. But also, how much more value is a hex code type adding to your code base? Is that going to help you sleep better at night? Instead of just having a string type.
Just name it hex. Just put it in the variable name.
Exactly. Figure it
out. Cool. Okay. I'm with you there. I like that. And by the way, I'm not advocating for this kind of Grug style, copying of interfaces. The reason I bring it up is in Go, it's all we have. We don't have fancy things in Go. We're famous for not having fancy things. In fact, we're very much rocks and sticks programmers sometimes. And we can inherit fields, kind of. It's not inheritance. It's we call it embedding. We can embed fields from one struct into another struct. Mm-hmm. But very often we're doing very Grug-ish style things that have more elegant solutions in a language like TypeScript. So,
yeah, and I guess like a lot of that I think is pretty easy for AI to understand as well. Like AI doesn't need to do any introspection. It's just literally there. It's exposed. And that I think, maybe there's something TypeScript can learn from there. But
it's funny you bring that up. I just had a podcast 10 episodes back with Natalie Pastunovich about this topic. She's done a lot of AI research recently and is a Go programmer. And basically her assertion is Go is the best programming language if you're using AI tooling, because it gets it right, like way with much higher frequency than any language, like especially JavaScript, because there's a billion different ways to write JavaScripts, and in Go there's like one kind of way to do it, and it's kind of like rocks and sticks, but that doesn't matter too much to the computer. So it is interesting how there's almost this new metric for, I think, how we will grade programming languages in the future. This new metric it's not, readability or elegance or expressivity. It's this other thing that's like, how easy is it for the machine to write this code?
Absolutely. I think TypeScript definitely outscores JavaScript on that metric as well, just because there's so much more metadata about the code that's being written. It's just so much more. It's so much more explicit. So it's weird, that feature. I'm still not quite adjusted to the idea that machines are going to inevitably take all our jobs. I'm holding out.
I mean, I don't think they will, but I do think that it's like another metric of developer experience is like, how often does my like Copilot tool get it right versus get it wrong? Where I'm at on the AI discussion, not that we need to launch into a fully separate thing, but it's looking to me that we're just going to have, much better tooling every year, kind of like we always have. And the technical skills that you'll need to operate that tooling will still exist. The foundational knowledge in order to be able to use those tools will still be very similar, right? You still need to be able to read and understand code and stuff, but maybe the day-to-day monotony of typing it yourself will be a little less hard. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like a second industrial revolution, right? In the first one, individual people got a lot better at producing goods, and producing more goods. Individual productivity rose through the roof. We're going to have the same thing happen to us, and that is going to mean fewer jobs. That's just how that works.
I think it'll mean fewer jobs of the jobs we have now. I think it'll definitely mean different jobs, though, like a lot of new different jobs.
Yes, but fewer jobs, I think, overall.
You think fewer jobs overall? Okay, now we got to stop and talk about this.
I mean, isn't that obvious? I mean, like, that's...
Well, it didn't happen with the Industrial Revolution, right? It's not like we have less jobs. We just have different jobs.
So, yes. But I mean, there are absolutely fewer jobs. Like, it takes a lot more people to till the land with plows than it does to have a steam donkey, or something like that, to have an industrial thing do the thing. So there is only not that many people in the world need websites. Some people need websites. So there is an amount of, like, it's not like we have enough work out there for every single person in the world to be employed as a web developer. Correct. So once that need is met, then I think the value in the web development industry will go down, so people will be paid less, I think, to work as web developers, and fewer web developers will be needed because an individual web developer can contribute more. And so there will be fewer jobs in the web development industry. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm talking more on like a jobs, because I mean, boot dev isn't just about web development, right? We do a lot of like just more generic, like computer science and programming stuff. And so if the take is eventually we will have far fewer web development jobs because we can automate so much of that away, which is also kind of interesting because in a lot of ways, like WordPress and Shopify and stuff kind of quote unquote took a lot of web developer jobs, but the internet has just grown at such a wild pace that we still haven't been able to keep up. But like on like a long time horizon, I just outright agree with you. Like there's going to be, individual productivity rises. We don't need that many websites. But the idea of engineering software to solve human problems, I can't imagine that as an industry, like, I can't imagine that we don't create a ton of jobs just working on different problems where we still have to solve software related engineering problems, whether you're actually hands-on keyboard, right? Or you're Tony Stark in it with some weird, hologram shit. Like, however we're accomplishing those things, I have a very hard time believing that the total amount of jobs goes down, because if we're defining the number of jobs in absolute terms, then there's more jobs now than there were pre-industrial revolution, almost just because there's more people, right? Like populations grown. But if it's like relative terms of like job openings versus how many jobs are filled, then I think it's been really cyclical, almost just like with the economy.
I don't know. I think you're just going to have, it feels to me like just a nailed on fact that as individual productivity rises, you just need fewer people, to do the same amount of work. I guess what your argument is that more work will become available and we'll have this sort of endless pool of stuff we can build and things we can do. But it just doesn't feel that makes sense, I think.
Yeah, your first statement to me sounds very zero sum about the world, which is almost a philosophical / like macroeconomic viewpoint that maybe we disagree on. I tend to be very positive sum about like what humans want to work on. And so I like to think that, if we kind of solve a problem, right? Like we don't need to be tilling the field with plows all day, that we'll move on to work on things that aren't necessarily, necessary for survival, but like make our lives measurably better. And there will always be people starting initiatives to do that sort of thing and thus creating jobs. So that's my hope, at least. I mean, we could always have some sort of societal collapse where no one wants to do shit. And then like there's no jobs because we don't want to progress. But my hope is that the world continues to be this kind of positive sum experience where as we solve problems, we find more problems to solve, but like they're not as dire, right? It's not always solving like food and housing. Maybe we can solve those problems, but it's like other problems, health problems, right? Curing cancer, finding things to do all day that isn't scrolling on TikTok. Maybe there's other problems we can solve.
I think I see your point. I think I see what you mean. Like, we're deep in the weeds now in terms of philosophy, AI outlook, and I think, how can I put a bow on this? I think if web development skills become less valuable, I think, in the marketplace, then it's going to be cheaper for people to pursue that sort of initiative. It's going to be, I think, less risky for VCs to just fund a cool project, because web development is going to, I think web dev is pretty easy to get into right now. There's tons of free resources. AI is making things so much easier and people can be productive pretty quickly. Yeah, I can see that future.
Cool. I enjoyed that. I thought that was kind of a fun aside.
That was cool.
Cool. I've got one last TypeScript related question, I think. This one is classes. And it's also kind of a JavaScript TypeScript question. How often do you use classes? Are you a functional bro, or do you enjoy your objects and classes? I should say classes specifically. Give me your take.
I really like classes. I really like them. I think it's because they're just objects, really, like objects with a little bit of extra stuff in them in terms of how JavaScript treats them. I really like them. I think it's a nice way to organize code. I tend to err more on the sort of functional side, I think, just because I was a React developer for so long, and functions, and obviously React used to be classes, but I really got into it and enjoyed it when it was became functional components and all that sort of stuff. I really liked it, and I think my heart flutters when I see like a pipe function or a compose function. That feels to me like the right attitude. Getting your functions completely separate from each other, separating concerns as much as you can, making your code easy to code split. And I tend to dislike the sort of blobby kind of classes with methods on that inherit from other classes, that sort of thing. But I don't think there's any reason to dislike classes, especially in TypeScript, where the experience is really, really nice, because classes were like in TypeScript's first version, they shipped with classes. The experience of using classes in TypeScript is great. It's really, really good. Like they have a lot of guarantees that if they were perhaps shipped later, they might not have. Like it guarantees that your initial properties are assigned in the constructor, make sure that you're overriding methods in the right way. It's really nice.
It makes sense that it would be a good experience. Isn't the creator of C# also the creator of TypeScript or involved?
He's Anders Hellsberg, I think. He was brought in in probably TypeScript's like first month or something, or second month to head it up. Yeah, and because of that, there's this sort of weird idea that TypeScript is like, that's been around for a long time that TypeScript is somehow more object oriented than JavaScript, and it's just not true. Like TypeScript is got these amazing sort of generic functions and things like that. And so I don't buy that at all. But yeah, classes in TypeScript are really good, as they are in JavaScript, so pretty good too.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for coming on and talking about all sorts of things, especially TypeScript.
Nice.
Let everybody know where they can find you and your projects.
So I'm on totaltypescript.com. Basically, that's like the home of everything I do. There's a bunch of free resources on there. Oh my God, there's like articles, there's tips, there's free tutorials. Since about last August, I've been writing a book as well that is freely available on there, that got posted on, I think, 2 weeks ago. And that's also where all my paid courses are. So I released this course basically based on the book that's like a lot cheaper than anything I've done before. And it's basically designed to take you from beginner to intermediate. So that's the Pro Essentials course. And the book is called Essentials, or Total Typescript Essentials. And yeah, I'm super keen for more feedback on the book. Tons of people have been reading it and sending me messages and stuff, which is really gratifying, because writing a book is hard, really hard. And like a whole lot harder than recording a video course or coming on a podcast or things like that. Like it is extremely difficult, and I'm so happy that it's done and out there. It's just great. So totaltypescript.com is where you'll find all the stuff.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, Matt. Totaltypescript.com. Go check it out. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Lee.